Good morning, everyone. My name's Joel Crane. I work at a company called, well, you probably know, Hamina Wireless, and I do a bunch of different things there. Right now, I consider myself to be a TME, I think is kind of where I've landed. But, being a small company, being a startup, we all do a lot of different things. And a few of the things I get to do there is things like technical training, and I also get to work directly with the engineering team and helping them kind of keep the backlog organized and things like that. And one thing that comes up a lot, there's a lot of questions about how our heat maps work in Hamina. How do we calculate things? What do the different indicators in Hamina mean? And so that's what I want to talk about today. Now, I might dip into a little bit of like, what do we actually use this heat map for, that heat map for? I might talk about secondary coverage and things like that a little bit, but mostly what I want to focus on is I want to focus on how we draw the heat maps, how we build the data, and where that comes from. And I think there's actually quite a few different things for us to explore here. So yeah, let's jump right in. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about, UC touched on this a little bit in his presentation yesterday, is that there's really two main sources for heat maps in a tool like Hamina. I think this is true for pretty much every tool out there on the market that generates heat maps. You've got measured data, which comes from things like a site survey where you actually go and take measurements in the real world. And then there's simulated data. Simulated data is when we drop an access point into a predictive model and we create a simulation based on what we think is going to happen. And these are kind of the two main sources of pretty much all the data in a site survey and network planning tool. Now, I want to stop and talk about kind of the different design phases really quick, because there's these sort of different phases that we go through when we're building and deploying and monitoring and updating networks. So first off, we have the design phase, and there's a few different ways that you can use heat maps to design a network. Of course, I think the most common way is to do a simulation. We drop in a floor plan, we draw walls, we place APs, we calculate the coverage based on a predictive modeling. Now, one thing I want to say here really quick is that some people will call this a site survey. I absolutely do not call this a site survey. To me, this is a predictive model, maybe a virtual network design. I think that's perfectly okay too, but I think it's really important to get our terminology right and kind of keep these things separated out. So I like to call this a predictive model. And UC got an A+ yesterday. He said predictive model every time, so nice work, UC. The second way that you might design a network is with measured data by using an AP on a stick. So that's when you would, there's a few that, I don't know if you can see them on camera or not, but there's a few AP on a stick rigs here at the front of the room where we take an access point, we put it on a stick, we survey around the access point. And the great thing about this is that we build a heat map based on real world measurements. So remember, in the simulation world, it's a prediction. We're going to try to get it close, but there might be some things that we miss. There might be some inaccuracies. In fact, I personally think that if you can build a predictive model that's perfect, you maybe spent too much time on your predictive model. And so, or maybe you're really good at it and you can do it very quickly, but there's kind of a time and cost thing there. So doing an AP on a stick is going to give you very, very perfectly real-world accurate results because there's no simulation involved. And then the third way is if you do both, like using some sort of hybrid approach. I've done this a few times where maybe my predictive modeling tool wouldn't let me model the specific intricacies of certain parts of a building. And so what I'll do is do the predictive model in the carpeted spaces, in the spaces that are easy to do a simulation for, and then I'll go do an AP on a stick in the parts of the building where I really would just like to get some real-world data. You could do this in a stadium even. You could rig up a few APs pointed at a few different parts of the stadium and then go measure things and see what they look like, and then you could use that to inform a predictive model. So that's maybe another form of a hybrid. So when we're looking at the next phase is typically the validation phase. That's when we go on site and we survey the network that we've just deployed. We call this a post-deployment validation survey. This is almost always measured data. We're going to go and measure the network and see what it looks like and draw heat maps based on the real world. And then we might do things like move an AP or two around. We might end up adding one or two APs. It kind of depends on how accurate your predictive model was. If the better your predictive model was, the less work you're going to have to do after you do your post-deployment validation. Hopefully you survey it, you go, yep, everything looks great, and you pack up and go home, and that's the end. And then there's the final phase, which is the operation and monitoring phase. UC touched on this a little bit in his talk yesterday too. But this kind of raises some questions with me, like, okay, well, how do we monitor the network long term? Like, how do we look to see like how the network is doing? Do we do that with more site surveys? Oh, I don't think so. I mean, doing a site survey is a fairly labor-intensive process, and I don't think anybody is actually going to go back on site and do more site surveys just to check on the network and see how it's doing. Maybe some of us do for our, some networks that we work on every day or something like that, but I think for the most part, we're probably not going to do that. And so I think one of the most interesting ways that we can do that is with a hybrid approach, like UC showed in his presentation yesterday, by going and using the real-world data to inform a simulation. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Also, as we're thinking about the operation and monitoring phase, how can we get some data into our model? How can we get the data in and generate heat maps without going back on site? And a way that we at Hamina have found to do this is we have found that we can just connect to a cloud vendor's API, and we can pull data out of that API and use that data to inform the model. We can get things like channel utilization. We can get client counts. How many clients are associated to each radio? We can get the RSSI of the clients, and we can get the access point to access point RSSI. That's a really, really big one. We can look and see how do all the different APs see each other, and we can also get the access point model and how it's oriented. That's really important, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So then in the remediation and upgrade phase, we've got these couple of different ways that we can get this data. I mentioned the live data using the AP to AP measurements. And one thing that we've been working on at Hamina right now is we're working on using the historical site survey data. So that's another potential place to bring data into the model. We could look at the site survey data that you did in your post-deployment validation and look at what the access points are doing today, what's their transmit power, which models are mounted where, and we can use that also to inform the predictive model. Okay, so now what I want to do is just kind of talk about the nuts and bolts of just sort of how we generate these heat maps, and then after this, I'm pretty much going to jump into live demo for the rest of the time. So, real quick primer on how you generate a heat map in a predictive model is we're going to use a few different things to calculate loss. That's one of the biggest things that we're going to do. We're going to start with the transmit power of the AP and the gains and losses that come from the antenna. I'll talk about that more a little bit later on. And then we have free space path loss. You might see that it slopes off very, very sharply at first. And then we start encountering obstacles. Like, for example, we might encounter a wall. And then when we encounter the wall, we're going to see a certain amount of loss. And then the RF exits the other side of the wall. And if we see another wall or something like that, then the RF will exit the other side of the wall, and we see more loss. So predictive models are primarily built around simulating this. We simulate free space path loss, loss from walls, and loss from attenuating objects. And then we have gain from things like antennas. Okay, so now let's just jump into Hamina, and I'll show you what that process looks like, and sort of, we'll just kind of march through each little piece of this. So I'm just going to make a new model from scratch. So we'll call this one Initech. This is what we've been doing in our deep dive. By the way, one huge advantage of having a speaking slot like this is I get a free 30 minutes of extra deep dive. So the people that are in the Hamina deep dive right now, I said, don't worry about how heat maps generate. I'll show you tomorrow. So let's go ahead and bring in a floor plan. So I'll just bring in a PDF. This is going to let me cheat a little bit because this PDF happens to have vector graphics, and they're all separated out into these nice layers, and so I can have Hamina automatically draw the walls for me. So, okay, first thing we need to do, we need to set the scale, and this is a very, very important step because remember, free space path loss is a really, really big part of how we calculate these heat maps. So having your scale correct is very, very important. Okay, so now let's go ahead and draw the walls. Now, normally, a little caveat here. Normally, I am a manual wall drawing guy. Just want you to know that. Normally, I like to manually draw these, especially for a serious project or something like that. But this particular project has has these pretty clean walls that are going to work pretty well. So let's just pop it into 3D here, and there we go. There's all of our walls drawn in. So then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to build this project, and we're going to use it for all of our predictive modeling stuff. So I'm going to rename this to floor 1, and then let's go stack up. All of our floors. If I remember correctly, this one needs to be weeded out. So yep, that's a floor that I don't care about, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove that. One thing I do recommend is weed out stuff out of your project that isn't important. Go get your floors named, get that stuff all set up really nicely. It's really great for when you're making reports and keeping things organized. I just think that going through and naming everything correctly and getting it all set up correctly is really important. Okay, so now that we've got those all ready to go, let's align our floors. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to open up our floor alignment tool. I'm going to add our floors to the building, and we're going to go look at floor 1. And then I'm going to align floor 3 with floor 1 just by aligning those concrete pillars in the corners. So we'll do that one there. We'll do that one there. And there we go. Now we've got all of our floors aligned, and we've got a predictive model that's basically ready to go. Now, one thing that I have done here is I have made some huge assumptions about what this building is made of. I have assumed that this is drywall everywhere, but even worse than that, an even worse thing that I did is I assumed that these drywalls attenuate 4 dB. So one thing I really strongly prefer to do when I go on is I like to go on site and measure some of these walls. And the way that I'll do this, and I'll just use some icons here to kind of demonstrate, is I'll set up something that generates a beacon in the 5 gigahertz band. It can be the hotspot on your phone. That's totally fine. It just needs to make a beacon in the 5 gigahertz band. That's all that matters. And then I will place, then I'll take a measurement on the close side of the wall. Maybe we see negative 65 dBm on the close side of the wall. And then I'll take another measurement on the other side of the wall, and maybe we see negative 70 on that side of the wall. That's 5 dB of loss. So then I can go plug that into my predictive model. So, for example, here we could go click on this and say, okay, well, it's only a 1 dB difference, so it's really not going to make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. I like what Fernay says. He says, I'm more of a 2 to 4 dB kind of guy. Wasn't it 2 to 4 dB? You're a 1 dB kind of guy? Wow, so accurate. I typically worry about around 3 dB is when I'm really starting to think okay, yeah, this is going to make a pretty significant difference for the predictive model. Okay, so let's just go drop some APs in here really quick. We won't spend a lot of time on that, but that brings me to another thing that I wanted to point out about how we generate heat maps in Hamina. Anybody notice that it's pretty quick, right? Oh, we don't have any floor plans here, or we don't have any walls here really quick. So let's just add those. So we'll just do this, we'll do the little dance one more time here. So we'll click on all of the glass. We'll click on all of the, oh, I messed up. Of course I messed up. Well, you know what, we'll just go back to floor 1 and we'll use that. That's totally fine. Okay, so one thing I want to point out really quick is you might notice that it's pretty fast, right? We generate these heat maps basically in real time, and that's something I very specifically want to talk about today. One of the ways that we do this is we do this by dynamically changing the amount of sample points. So we take the axis point, we take the antenna pattern, and we basically look at beams coming off of the axis point, and we distribute sample points out across the map, and we basically check all of those sample points to render the heat map whenever something changes in the predictive model. If we have relatively few sample points, we can generate that heat map very quickly. Notice you can actually kind of see the sample points a little bit. If you look very closely, they're coarse enough that you can individually see where those sample points are. But then when we drop the AP, and I'm going to deselect everything so everything regenerates, we then recalculate with more sample points, and then we recalculate with more sample points, and then we recalculate with more sample points until we have a pixel-perfect heat map. And you can see the progress of this if you look along the top here. So right there, if I nudge an AP, you see that there's actually 2 progress bars that happen. You saw those 2 up there at the very top. Let's just, actually I'm gonna go find another, I think I've got a full project that I have a full building. Let's see if we can get something a little more intensive. Yeah, there we go, that'll work. So here, you can see that there's a light blue progress bar. That light blue progress bar shows us the progress of all of the heat map generation for this floor. So that's everything that's happening on this floor, whereas the dark blue progress bar is for the current generation stage. So you notice that the blue bar will complete its calculations multiple times. That's a stage every time it fills up the light bar, and then the light bar shows us the whole thing. Makes sense, right? So now, looking at that, you might encounter a project that is so large that it takes a good 2 or 3 minutes, 4 minutes. I've seen a couple projects that maybe even take 5 minutes to calculate to the highest stage. But one thing I almost never do, I almost never wait for the highest heat map calculation stage. Because already, in the first couple of seconds in this one, I'm like, yeah, we're good. There might be a couple of little tiny shadows and things like that appear, but there's really not going to be anything significant. Usually, after the first 1 or 2 stages, I move on to my next task. I move on to the next floor. I go to the next place that I want to do some design changes and start reviewing something else. Now, there's a couple of other things that we do to keep things nice and fast in Hamina and kind of keep things calculating very, very quickly. This is a 3-story building, so we're calculating everything for the floor below, the current floor, and the floor above. Now, if you have a building with more floors, and maybe you've got something like an atrium or something like that that goes all the way through your building, then you might want to see the calculations for all of the different floors that you have. That might become really important. So here's an example of that. I've actually got a hole in the floor here on the 3rd floor, and if we go down to the 2nd floor, and we just click on our AP that's on the floor above. So there it is. There's our AP right there that's on the floor above. So now you can actually see how the RF is traveling through free space from the floor above down here to this floor. So if you've got a floor plan that hey, I like that my mouse got stuck. It's always cool when a bug that you've never ever seen before happens on stage in front of a couple of hundred people, and it's going to go on YouTube later for the whole world to enjoy for all of eternity. It's fantastic, love it. Another thing that you can do though is that if you want to see what the calculations are going to look like for the whole building, you can come over here to the heat map settings and you can turn on full building propagation. So what this is going to do is instead of just calculating for a floor below, current floor, floor above, this is going to calculate everything. We stuck a beta label on it because we were worried about performance. It's been fine for several months now, so we'll probably take that label off pretty soon. But you can do that if you're working in an environment where you know the RF is going to propagate way past more than plus minus 1 floor. So it's something that I like to do. Okay, next thing I want to talk about a little bit is I just want to talk about the different types of objects that you can place in Hamina and how they affect signal propagation. So let's go take a look at a tiny warehouse design that I have. So here we go. Here's a little warehouse that I have. I've done a network design on, and you can see that we've got some different objects and things like that here. And I'm actually going to bring my client height back down to just to 1 meter there, and maybe I'll show you the specifics of that if we have a little bit more time. But basically, what I've got here is we've got objects like walls. Remember how I told you how those work? We have a one-time hit of loss as the RF travels through that wall. It doesn't matter what angle the RF takes as it goes through the wall. When the RF hits the wall, it gets dropped by X amount of dB. Maybe that's 3, maybe that's 10 dB. In these cases, I think I have like 15 dB walls or something around the outside. It doesn't matter how it travels through that wall. Whereas something like a shelf, like this one right here, let's switch this over to a 9166. Let's bring it down to 2 meters, so it's actually down below the top of the shelf. So with an attenuating object, this is a different type of object in a predictive modeling tool that instead of hitting the RF one time, regardless of the angle, we calculate how many dBs of loss there is as the RF travels through it on a per meter basis. So here for this warehouse shelf, this profile that I have, I'm calculating 8 dB of loss per meter. Now, it's easy to look at that /m and go, oh, dBm. No. Don't get confused. That's dB of loss per meter. So if you do that measurement process that I talked about earlier, where we measure the loss of a wall, you do have to do an extra little calculation here, not just to calculate how much loss did we see in the wall, but we also need to check and see how far did the RF travel to get through the object that we're measuring. And it's just one more division thing that you have to do when you're doing your little calculation. Very easy, very straightforward, but just something to be aware of. So I like to use attenuating objects for solid things like warehouse shelving involving machinery, maybe liquid tanks, anything like that that's like a solid object. Those are the sorts of things that we need to kind of think about. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the source of the data. I want to talk about how and where we generate the antenna patterns for access points. This is really important because every access point out there, every antenna out there makes a different coverage pattern. It broadcasts a different pattern that we use to inform the predictive model. So pretty much every vendor out there, with a few exceptions, gives us they basically give us a CSV that shows us all of the gains at all the different angles. So it's basically gain in dBi on a per angle basis. If you've ever wondered why, hey, I asked Hamina for this antenna pattern like 5 or 6 weeks ago and they haven't got it added yet, usually the holdup is we need to get this data from the antenna vendor. This is usually the thing holding us up. Jim's waving his hand back there. He's one of the vendors that gives it to me. And there's some of your favorite antenna vendors that are in the room right now are like super quick and on the ball, and they always give it to us. And sometimes they come to us and say, hey, we're going to release a new antenna or a new AP in a couple of weeks. Here's the data, and we'll have it in there on day one. So we get to work with them very closely, very directly. But sometimes we don't get this data. Every now and then, all we get is a blurry datasheet photo. And we'll ask like, hey, do you have the data that built this datasheet? And they go, nah, no, sorry, just don't have it. In some cases, it's a modern AP, and maybe they contracted out to somebody else to build the AP or the antenna for them. In some cases, it's just a really old AP, and they just don't have it around anymore. And who can blame them? Like, a 15-year-old AP, who's going to keep the antenna pattern data around for that? So one thing that we do sometimes when we absolutely have to is we'll actually trace in the antenna patterns. Now I'm going to pick on the 9166 really quick here. We got the antenna patterns from Cisco. Don't worry, we got the patterns. Yep, my man Nicholas back here. We definitely got these, but I'm just going to use it as an example. And so what we can do is we can say, well, I'm going to take a measurement every degree, and then I'm just going to get in here and trace in this pattern. So I'm just going to do a really, really terrible trace-in job here. Normally, like when I do these, I get nice and close, and I like to go in and make sure that we've got every little nook and cranny and everything like that. And then once we're done with that, once we've got it all traced in, so let's see, we'll just do a really rough job here. Ooh, it's not gonna look good. Hang on. Oh, we can fix it. Oh yeah. Hey Nicholas, I'm gonna put this in production. I hope are you okay with that? Okay, cool. Yeah, it's totally accurate. It's going to be fine. Okay, so once we've got that traced in, the other thing that I will do is I'll go in here and I will set the markers, and I'll center. I should have centered it first, but we're not going for accuracy here. We're just going for demo here. So I'll say like, okay, my outer circle is 0 dBi, my inner circle is -25, and then we copy a CSV to the clipboard. I'm going to strip the formatting off of that, and then we're going to take it over into a really, really sophisticated antenna modeling tool called Microsoft Excel. And we'll paste that in, and now my scaling is all off, so it looks completely wrong. But there we go. That's it. That's one way that we can generate an antenna pattern. So probably the worst demo, and probably not confidence-inspiring at all for how this is done. But I just wanted to show you, one of the ways that we have kind of improved the process. Because for a long time, when we got bitmaps of things, we just couldn't do it. Basically, it was just like, yeah, no, we just can't get them added. But now we have the ability to get those in. By the way, this tool, I'm not an engineer. I write very little code. The Packet Potato is the biggest piece of code I've ever written, and I 100% did this in Claude.ai, just asking it questions and building up a little code base. So if you ever need to build little tools and things like that, and you're not a developer, you don't write code, these AI tools are pretty incredible, and they can help you build some pretty great things like this. So at least great in my opinion. After you've seen it, you might not agree, but I think it's pretty great. So okay, so let's talk really quickly about measured data before we maybe take a quick look at live data and then wrap things up. So Dan is going to airplay to my Mac really quick. And we're just going to talk about how we generate heat maps for survey data. So Dan is going to start out by doing a point survey. So remember, we've now transitioned from the simulated data world to the measured data world, and he's wearing a device that's going to collect beacons from access points. There's two main types of survey out there. There's passive surveys where we passively listen for beacons from access points, and then there's active surveys where we associate a client to an access point and exchange data. An active survey isn't nearly as useful as a passive survey. Passive sounds worse, but it gives us a much richer data set. So when Dan it taps on the map, so he's going to do a point survey here, if the hardware connects. We'll see. It's probably still booting up. Sorry I didn't give you much warning, Dan. If he taps on the map to take a point survey, it's going to sweep all of the channels, and it's going to put them all in one point on the map, and then he can move to the next place, tap again, it sweeps all the channels and places a point on the map. Those are great for environments where you don't have mobility, you can't move around very freely, but they don't give you a lot of data. The data is very thin. What we like to do is where possible, a continuous survey. The way that a continuous survey works, how are we doing, Dan? Any luck? And he was making fun of my Lightning iPhone a few minutes ago, like, oh, those Lightning iPhone, man, you get connection problems and stuff. And who's laughing now, Dan? Actually, you probably are, because I'm the one on stage. But one thing I wanted to point out really quick here, maybe we can't demo it, but when you're doing a survey, in fact, I think what I'm going to do, Dan, I'm going to fall back to drawing. How's that sound? Would that be okay? Okay. Let's fall back. We'll fall back to good old whiteboard activity here really quick. I think I have a blank one I can use. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Okay, so when you do a continuous site survey, when you tap on a map and start walking in a specific direction, we start gathering data points. So we sweep all the channels and we put it in a data point. We sweep all the channels and we put it in a data point, and we're basically filling up a buffer. So we have this buffer, and we're saying here, data point, data point, data point, data point, data point, data point, and that buffer can just infinitely keep filling up with data points. Then when you get to another location on the map, you decide that you're going to stop, start, turn, or I like to add change speed. When we do that, then we draw a line between the 2 points that you just tapped, and we evenly distribute those points along the map. So one thing that's really important when you're doing a site survey is between your taps, walk at a consistent speed. Now you can change speed. You can walk really quickly. You can walk very quickly. Sorry, you see I can't get my mouse over there to click it. Maybe. Yeah, sorry, man. You can, when you're walking and you tap on the map, you have an opportunity to change speed. So one thing that I like to do is if I'm getting a little bit confused about where I am, where I'm going, maybe there's just a lot of people or something like that around, I will walk and then tap on the map, and then I will just slow to a crawl to my next point, and then when I get to that next point, I'll tap and I'll take off again and walk at normal speed again. Another thing that you can do is when you walk up to a door, let's say you need to traverse a door and you have to unlock the door or something like that, walk up to the door, tap on the map, get your keys out, unlock the door, push it open with your foot, tap on the same spot again, and then keep moving. What we do in that spot, we just gathered 100 different data points while you're standing there and fumbling with your keys, and we just average everything out inside that single point right there. So really, in front of the door, you just end up with a very, very good piece of data right there because your survey device had lots of time to gather the data. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about before we wrap up today is I want to talk about the different types or different ways that you can turn simulations, the different ways that you can simulate data in Hamina. So if we look at our Heatmap settings right now, we are using, let's use walls and objects to inform our predictive model. So you see there's our attenuation from walls, obstacles, all that stuff that we've been talking about. The next way that you can build out a heat map in Hamina is you can also just use the environment type. So with this, what we basically do, this is really, really simplified, but we basically do a blanket of attenuation on the entire map based on the environment type that you've chosen. This gets automatically disabled the first time you draw a wall or an attenuating object. The main purpose of this is for the sales guys. They can bring in a floor plan, drop in some APs, and get a rough estimate for how many are going to be on the map. Personally, I like to draw me some walls. That's how I do it. I think that's the objectively correct correct way to do it. And then the final way that we can do that is, or that we can build this, is with that access point to access point data that we talked about earlier. So we could switch our simulation type to AP to AP, and now as we grab our access point and move it around, now notice that the coverage area is dynamically changing. And the way that we did that is we look at how does each access point see each other, and then we basically build out attenuating objects between them. And those attenuating objects are used to create the predictive model. And that's all from just looking at how do all the different APs see each other. So really multiple ways that you can pull this data into Hamina and use it. So, okay, that's what I've got. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.